The nights of early 1941 pressed down on Britain with a weight that felt almost physical, as if the darkness itself were an occupying force. London had endured months of bombings, entire districts reduced to ash and silhouette, and the faint smell of burnt brick drifted across the city even hours after the fires died. Winston Churchill, Britain's unbreakable symbol of defiance, carried the devastation in silence as he toured the smoldering ruins. The public saw determination in his bulldog stare and uplifted cigar, but privately, he walked these ruins with a mind that fluctuated between iron resolve and a gnawing doubt that threatened to undermine his confidence. The stakes were impossible. An empire stretched thin, a public exhausted, military setbacks in Greece and North Africa, and no confirmation that America would intervene in time to save Britain from collapse. Churchill returned to Downing Street night after night with the same ritual: the final reports from the Air Ministry, casualty lists, intelligence summaries, and the latest intercepts from Bletchley Park. These documents were his battlefield, each report a reminder of how close Britain was to strangulation. Supplies were dwindling, U-boat attacks intensified, and the Luftwaffe showed no sign of relenting. The Prime Minister confronted these papers alone in his study, the lamp casting a hard pool of light over handwritten notes and maps. Behind his public bravado, the uncertainties gnawed at him. Questions of whether he had miscalculated Hitler's intentions or overestimated Britain's capacity to endure. Doubt crept in through the cracks of exhaustion, a silent adversary capable of undermining the very leadership Britain depended on. The British War Cabinet sensed Churchill's fatigue, though they misinterpreted its cause. They believed it came from the relentless pressures of strategy and diplomacy, not realizing that Churchill wrestled with something deeper: a personal fear of failing the very nation he had sworn to defend. The ghosts of Gallipoli still lingered in his memory, whispering warnings of disastrous decisions that could ruin him again. Now at 66, the weight of command fell heavier than ever. Every destroyed street, every lost civilian, and every shattered building seemed to echo with the same question: had he led Britain into a fight it could not possibly win? Though he would never admit it aloud, the fear tightened around him like the blackout curtains that shrouded London's windows. The intelligence situation compounded his anxiety. Ultra-decrypts revealed worrying patterns: German deployments shifting, intensified preparations for the spring offensive, and new U-boat wolfpack tactics threatening Atlantic convoys. Churchill read each report with mounting tension. Britain's lifeline was being severed in slow motion, and he knew that if the convoys failed, the island would starve. The crisis unfolded with mathematical certainty: fewer ships, fewer supplies, fewer options. These numbers haunted him more than any bomb falling on London. They represented a slow, inevitable strangulation, one that no speech or defiant gesture could deter. He had staked everything on endurance, and endurance now depended on a fragile chain of ships moving through an ocean filled with unseen enemies. Even within the military, frustration simmered. Some generals questioned Churchill's aggressive strategies, arguing that Britain needed time, not bravado, to rebuild strength. Others complained of overextension, particularly in North Africa, where early victories had given way to setbacks under Rommel's sudden counterassault. Churchill felt these criticisms keenly. His leadership relied on a delicate balance between audacity and caution, and now both sides of his nature clashed violently within him. The war demanded bold action, yet the nation demanded preservation. Every misstep risked disaster. Every hesitation risked defeat. The tension between these impulses fueled his inner conflict, deepening the storm of doubt that he struggled to conceal. Yet in public, Churchill projected an almost theatrical confidence. He toured bombed neighborhoods, shaking hands with firemen, comforting the homeless, admiring the courage of air raid wardens, and speaking to crowds who saw him as a living bulwark against despair. But even as he delivered his famously uplifting lines, he could feel the internal strain. He crafted his speeches carefully, shaping each phrase to carry emotional weight and strategic clarity. Still, once the cheers faded and the crowds dispersed, Churchill was left with a truth he could not ignore. The nation believed in him more strongly than he believed in himself during these restless nights. It was a paradox that frightened him more than the Luftwaffe's incendiaries. His closest advisors noticed subtle cracks, moments when Churchill drifted into long silences during meetings, staring at maps as if searching for answers hidden between the lines. He snapped more quickly, demanded more urgently, and paced the cabinet room with growing intensity. Ministers attributed this to pressure, but for Churchill the pressure came from an internal reckoning. He felt the weight of history on his shoulders, a sensation both electrifying and terrifying. He knew that future generations would judge these months not by intention, but by outcome. He also knew that a failure now would be catastrophic not just for Britain but for the free world. The enormity of that burden fed a private storm of self-doubt that he battled alone. As the winter deepened, Churchill confronted his greatest leadership crisis, not a military threat, but the fear that he might falter at the moment Britain needed him most. His nights grew longer, his reflections darker, and his confidence became entangled with the nation's fate. It was during this bleak season, when the Blitz continued without mercy and the Atlantic convoys neared breaking point, that Churchill realized something unequivocal. Britain did not merely need plans or speeches, it needed a message powerful enough to rekindle faith across the entire country. And it was the search for this message, the one that would rescue morale and steady his own resolve, that became the defining struggle of his darkest hours. In the early months of 1941, Churchill moved through Downing Street like a man pursued by invisible forces. Every corridor seemed to echo with demands, military cables arriving by the hour, aides delivering grim updates, ministers requesting decisions that could alter the fate of continents. But the noise around him paled beside the turmoil within. He felt as though he were steering a ship through a storm so vast that no captain could see the horizon. Reports from the Admiralty painted convoys being torn apart by U-boats, each sinking a blow to Britain's lifeline. In these moments, Churchill felt a sharp pang of responsibility, a sensation that bordered on dread. The weight of every sailor lost in the Atlantic settled on him like an anchor dragging his confidence downward. Compounding the crisis was the growing realization that Britain stood truly alone. The United States had not yet committed troops, providing only limited support through Lend-Lease, and Roosevelt remained constrained by domestic politics. Churchill understood the delicate position. America sympathized but hesitated, watching Britain struggle from across the ocean, uncertain whether the island could survive long enough to justify full engagement. The Soviets remained neutral, their uneasy pact with Hitler casting a shadow over Europe. Churchill saw isolation tightening around Britain like a noose. It was one thing to rally a nation against external threats. It was quite another to maintain hope when the world's greatest powers appeared unwilling to intervene. The military situation deepened Churchill's anxiety. Intelligence from North Africa warned that Rommel, newly arrived, energetic and brilliant, was preparing an offensive that could reclaim all the ground British forces had recently won. The Middle East, with its vital oil supplies and strategic routes, hung in the balance. Meanwhile, Greece teetered on the brink, pleading for reinforcements Britain could scarcely afford. Churchill agonized over each decision: send help and risk overextension, or hold back and risk allowing Hitler another foothold in Europe. His strategic instincts pulled in one direction, his realist caution in another, and the resulting tension knotted inside him like a constant, unrelenting pressure. Privately, Churchill feared that the nation's morale, Britain's greatest weapon, was beginning to erode. The newspapers tried to maintain a brave face, but he could sense the quiet exhaustion spreading through conversations on factory floors, in railway stations, and in air raid shelters. The Blitz had forged unity, but it had also drained strength. Families who had endured months of night bombings now faced food shortages, rationing, and the strain of separation from loved ones fighting abroad. Churchill knew morale was a battlefield of its own. If the British spirit collapsed, no army, no navy, and no number of speeches could save the nation. What haunted him most was the possibility that his leadership might not be enough to prevent that collapse. Within the war cabinet, dissent began to stir. Ministers whispered concerns about Churchill's aggressive strategies, his marathon work habits, and his growing impatience with cautious advice. They did not see the internal battle, only the surface. A prime minister more forceful, more volatile, more demanding. Churchill pushed them relentlessly, fearing that any sign of weakness would reverberate downward through every level of command. Yet the cabinet could not know how deeply he feared making the wrong decision, or how often those fears kept him awake long after midnight, staring at darkened windows that mirrored his own uncertainty. He could not afford self-doubt, yet he could not escape it. The pressure seeped into Churchill's daily routine. Meals often went untouched. Cigars burned away unsmoked as he paced rooms lost in thought. He slept in bursts, 2 hours here, an hour there, his mind never fully shutting down. When aides found him in the middle of the night, still hunched over maps or reading reports, they mistook his intensity for boundless energy. In truth, Churchill feared what might surface if he allowed himself too much rest. The doubts seemed strongest when the noise faded, when the city lay silent and only the distant hum of bombers could be heard over London's rooftops. Those were the moments when the question returned again and again: what if Britain did not win? Even Chartwell, his cherished refuge, provided little solace in those months. Though he visited briefly, hoping for the restorative calm he once found in its gardens and ponds, he discovered that the war followed him there too. Maps cluttered the dining room table. Briefings piled up in his study. He tried to paint, but the brush felt foreign in his hand, as though the part of him that once sought beauty in nature had dimmed under the weight of responsibility. The canvas remained blank, an unsettling reflection of his own uncertainty. Churchill realized then, perhaps for the first time, that doubt had infiltrated not just his duties but his identity. As winter gave way to early spring, Churchill recognized that he stood at a turning point, not of battlefield strategy but of personal resolve. He could feel his inner strength eroding, worn down by sleepless nights, devastating reports, and the immense isolation of command. He needed a spark, something to break through the gloom that clung to him like thick smoke after an air raid. What he did not yet know was that this spark would come not from generals, diplomats, or military successes, but from an unexpected source, one that would strike directly at his heart, ignite a renewal of purpose, and produce the message that would rally Britain in its darkest hour. By March 1941, the war's pressures had pressed Churchill into a psychological corner he had not experienced since the catastrophe of Gallipoli. Though he concealed it from ministers and military chiefs, he sensed that his once unshakable confidence was beginning to fray. Each morning he awoke with the same suffocating thought. Britain was standing on a cliff edge, and even a minor misjudgment could send the nation plunging into defeat. The Prime Minister's public persona, defiant, unbroken, roaring with certainty, was now a mask he had to lift with increasing effort. Behind it, the private Winston Churchill felt the first tremors of something he had not feared since youth, the possibility that his own leadership might fail when it mattered most. The cabinet, sensing tension, increased the frequency of briefings, debates, and emergency meetings. They saw Churchill driving himself with almost desperate intensity, often refusing advice that suggested prudence or restraint. But they did not understand the root of his urgency. Churchill felt time slipping, felt it as a tangible, almost physical force, as convoy losses mounted and the Luftwaffe increased its raids. Each setback fed the growing sense of internal collapse. Each moment wasted seemed an invitation to disaster. He pushed harder because he feared that loosening his grip even slightly would allow the war to outpace him. Exhaustion and apprehension became inseparable companions. The weight of responsibility left Churchill emotionally raw. During visits to bombed neighborhoods, he was struck not only by the destruction but by the faces of the survivors, faces that looked to him with trust and expectation. Children pointed to burned-out homes with a kind of bewildered bravery. Elderly men spoke as though Churchill were the embodiment of national endurance, as though his strength alone held back the tide of annihilation. It was a burden both inspiring and crushing. Every hopeful expression he encountered intensified his fear of failing these people, of being the leader who let them fall. It was this emotional undertow rather than strategic pressure that threatened to drag him into despair. Domestic politics added another layer of strain. Members of Parliament began to murmur about the sustainability of Churchill's leadership style. Some respected the ferocity of his will yet questioned his judgment in pursuing offensives abroad when Britain struggled to defend its own skies and seas. Critics argued that he stretched resources too thin, fought too many battles, and relied too heavily on speeches to maintain morale. Churchill listened to these criticisms in silence, outwardly unmoved. But in private moments, he replayed their words in his mind, dissecting them with grim precision. The idea that his own instincts might be flawed, might even be dangerous, cut deeper than any enemy bomb. His generals were no less divided. Some praised his strategic imagination and relentless engagement. Others grew frustrated, feeling he interfered too often in operational details. Churchill sensed their doubts, even when unspoken. He read the tension in their gestures during briefings, heard hesitation in their responses, and noted the absence of enthusiasm when he proposed bold operations. For a man who thrived on conviction, these subtle signals stoked his own uncertainty. Could he trust his judgment when even his commanders questioned it? The internal conflict became so intense that at times he felt physically unsteady, as though his mind were pulling him in two opposing directions. As the pressure mounted, Churchill began to question whether his famed ability to inspire was losing its potency. His speeches, once thunderous calls to endurance, now felt to him like strained attempts to keep himself afloat. He revised drafts repeatedly, searching for words that would rekindle the fire that once came easily. What had once been instinctive now felt forced. He worried the public would sense this shift, that they would detect a thinness beneath his rhetoric. The fear that his voice, his greatest weapon, might fail him was more terrifying than any military threat. For a leader whose strength lay in communication, to doubt one's own voice was to doubt the foundation of one's influence. Sleep became nearly impossible. Churchill lay awake for hours listening to the muffled boom of distant bombs and the ticking of the mantel clock. His thoughts churned relentlessly, replaying every critical decision he had made since taking office. He felt trapped within his own mind, unable to escape the cycle of second-guessing. What if he had misread Hitler? What if his refusal to consider negotiated peace earlier in the war had doomed Britain unnecessarily? What if his unwavering defiance was not courage but hubris? These were questions he dared not ask aloud, yet they haunted him with growing intensity as each night stretched into dawn. In this period of profound internal turmoil, Churchill reached the precipice of despair. He felt as though he were standing alone against an enemy not found on any map, the creeping paralysis of doubt. It was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow erosion, like waves hollowing stone. And just as his resolve reached its lowest ebb, when he stood dangerously close to losing the inner fire that sustained his leadership, something unexpected occurred. Something small, almost trivial on the surface, yet powerful enough to alter the course of his spirit. It was a moment of human connection, unplanned and unfiltered, that would strike deeper than any speech or strategic briefing. It was the beginning of the message that would save Britain. It happened on a raw, cold evening after another devastating raid on the East End. Churchill insisted on visiting the ruined districts despite objections from his security detail, who argued that unexploded bombs and delayed action fuses still posed serious threats. He brushed them aside, determined to see the damage himself, not as Prime Minister, but as a witness to what ordinary people endured. The streets were unrecognizable. Chimneys toppled like broken monuments, windows blown into glittering shards, the smell of smoke and wet mortar hanging in the air. As he stepped over debris illuminated by rescue workers' lanterns, he felt again the familiar mixture of grief, rage, and responsibility. But beneath all of it, the deeper doubt persisted, whispering that his leadership had not prevented this destruction. Residents huddled in makeshift shelters between piles of rubble. Women wrapped in blankets held children who stared at the Prime Minister with wide, exhausted eyes. Some men approached him with nods of recognition, their strength masking their own fatigue. Churchill stopped often to speak with them, offering words he hoped would comfort, though he feared they sounded hollow. He sensed the strain in their expressions, courage, yes, but also weariness that no speech could fully dispel. Standing among these ruins, he felt exposed, stripped of the illusion that rhetoric alone could carry the nation through. For a fleeting moment, he wondered whether he had asked too much of them, demanded too much endurance, expected too much faith. It was then, as Churchill approached a partially collapsed row of houses, that he heard a voice rise above the murmur of the crowd, a clear, steady voice of an elderly woman standing atop a mound of rubble where her home had once stood. She wore a soot-stained coat, and her hair was windswept from the night's chaos, but her expression was fierce and unwavering. She looked at Churchill as though she had been waiting for him specifically. Without preamble or hesitation, she called out words that cut through the cold air and through the fog clouding Churchill's mind. "You keep going, Winston. Don't you dare give up. We're still behind you." The crowd fell silent as the words hung in the air. Churchill stared at the woman, taken aback by the certainty in her voice. She had lost everything, her home, her possessions, perhaps even family, but her gaze carried no bitterness, no accusation. Instead, it held a determination that was almost fierce. Churchill felt something inside him jolt, as if a spark had been struck against stone. In that moment, the entire dynamic of leadership inverted. It was not he who inspired them, but they who steadied him. This reversal shocked him, for he had never allowed himself to imagine that the people might lift him up when he faltered. He approached her slowly, the rubble crunching under his boots. As he drew closer, he saw the fatigue in her eyes, deep lines etched by years of hard living, but beneath that, he saw a resilience that seemed carved from the very spirit of the nation. She repeated herself, softer this time but with equal conviction. Churchill felt the words strike deeper than any praise he had received from generals, ministers, or foreign leaders. This was not flattery. It was not politics. It was faith, pure, unfiltered faith from someone who had every reason to despair yet chose defiance instead. And it was directed at him, at a moment when he feared he deserved it least. He tried to respond, but for the first time in many months, words failed him. His throat tightened, and he felt a warmth behind his eyes that surprised him. He lifted his hat to her in a gesture of profound respect, but even that felt inadequate. The surrounding crowd began to murmur their agreement, voices rising with a collective resolve that seemed to push back the darkness itself. In the flickering glow of the rescue lamps, Churchill saw not a broken district but a living testament to the nation's soul, a soul that refused to be defeated, even when staring directly at devastation. This moment pierced the fog of doubt that had strangled his confidence. Churchill realized that he had been viewing leadership through a distorted lens. He had believed the burden rested solely on his shoulders, that the nation leaned on him alone. But here, amid the rubble, he discovered that the relationship ran both ways. The people were not passive recipients of inspiration. They were active participants in it, sustaining him just as he sustained them. Their resilience flowed upward as surely as his resolve flowed downward. This recognition struck him with an almost physical force, reshaping his understanding of what it meant to lead a nation at war. As Churchill left the ruins that evening, the woman's words echoed in his mind with a clarity that cut through every worry, report, and criticism that had plagued him for weeks. For the first time in months, he felt a genuine shift deep within, a rekindling of the flame that had dimmed under relentless strain. He realized that Britain's strength did not originate from speeches, strategies, or even its leaders. It came from its people, ordinary, steadfast, unbreakable. This revelation would guide him through the darkest days yet to come and spark the creation of a message so powerful, so deeply rooted in the nation's spirit, that it would reawaken Britain's resolve and reshape the course of the war. That night, back at Downing Street, Churchill felt a strange, unfamiliar lightness settle over him. The weight that had pressed on his chest for weeks, an invisible burden he had grown too exhausted to even name, seemed to loosen. The elderly woman's words echoed with a clarity that no strategic briefing or cabinet argument had ever achieved. He sat alone in his study, a fresh stack of casualty reports at his elbow, yet for the first time in many days, he did not feel overwhelmed by them. Instead, he studied the lines of text with a renewed sense of purpose. Britain was suffering, yes, but Britain was not breaking. And if the people refused to bend, then neither would he. The power of that moment lay not merely in the woman's words, but in the raw honesty behind them. She had not offered empty praise or theatrical encouragement. She had spoken with the authority of someone who had endured the worst the enemy could inflict and still stood upright. Churchill realized she had given him something he had not received from ministers, generals, or foreign allies: unconditional trust. To be trusted by someone who had lost everything was a gift of staggering magnitude. It reframed his entire sense of responsibility, not as a burden imposed on him, but as a duty entrusted to him by people who believed, deeply and instinctively, that he would not fail them. He poured himself a measure of brandy and walked to the window, looking out over the darkened city. Fire still smoldered in the east. Rescue teams moved like shadows through the ruins, and the distant wail of ambulances drifted across the night. It was a scene of devastation but also of endurance. Churchill realized that the British people understood something he had forgotten in his spiral of doubt, that leadership was not about perfection or certainty. It was about refusing to give up. The woman's message, "Don't you dare give up. We're still behind you," had not been directed at the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It had been directed at Winston the man. And it had reached him. With this realization came a profound shift in his internal landscape. Churchill felt his fear transform into determination. The dread that had clouded his thinking began to evaporate, replaced by a sharper, clearer focus. The crisis had not changed. The U-boats still prowled the Atlantic, Rommel still advanced in North Africa, and the Luftwaffe still pounded British cities. But Churchill's mindset had changed. He no longer saw himself as standing alone against catastrophe. He saw himself standing with a nation that refused to collapse. That unity, leader and people, one reinforcing the other, became the foundation upon which he rebuilt his confidence. Even his physical demeanor changed. Early the next morning, aides noticed he walked with a steadier step, his posture more upright, his voice more resonant. At the daily briefing, he listened more intently and questioned more sharply, not from desperation but from renewed conviction. He pushed the chiefs of staff for bolder planning, but now with a clarity that had been missing in recent weeks. The generals sensed the difference immediately. This was the Churchill they recognized. The bulldog leader who refused to accept the impossible, the strategist who could imagine victory even when defeat seemed more likely. His restored energy rippled through the entire room. Most striking was the change in his tone when he addressed the Admiralty later that day. Instead of focusing solely on losses and setbacks, he spoke of resilience and adaptation. He demanded aggressive new countermeasures against the wolf packs, tighter convoy escorts, expanded air reconnaissance and accelerated shipbuilding, but he delivered these demands not with frustration, but with a sharpened urgency grounded in confidence. He emphasized that Britain must fight smarter, not merely harder. For the first time in weeks, the naval commanders left the meeting not dispirited but invigorated. Churchill's renewed fire had become contagious. By evening, Churchill returned to writing. He drafted notes for a new broadcast, not yet a full speech but the early stirrings of one. As he wrote, he felt the words flowing with a natural force he had not experienced since the Battle of Britain months earlier. The paragraphs carried a deeper emotional resonance, shaped not by fear but by the encounter in the rubble. He wanted this message to speak to every corner of the country, to every family living under bombardment, to every sailor battling Atlantic storms, to every factory worker laboring under ration light. It would not be a speech merely to steady Britain. It would be a speech to remind the nation, and himself, why they fought. And so, as the city settled into another night under threat of bombs, Churchill realized the path ahead had changed. He no longer sought a message that would save Britain through rhetoric alone. He sought one that reflected the truth he had witnessed among the ruins, that Britain endured not because of one man, but because of millions who refused to yield. The message would be their message, the voice of that elderly woman made universal. And as Churchill prepared to give that voice form, he felt for the first time in months the steady, unbreakable certainty that Britain could and would survive the darkest hours still to come. In the days that followed, Churchill worked with an intensity that surprised even those accustomed to his tireless schedule. Yet this was not the frantic, anxiety-driven energy that had marked the previous weeks. It was controlled, deliberate, and focused, like a man who had rediscovered his footing after stumbling dangerously close to the precipice. He approached his writing not as a speechwriter hunting for phrases, but as a leader distilling the essence of a nation's soul into words. He understood now that the message Britain needed was not merely strategic or political, it had to be spiritual. It had to articulate the unyielding defiance he had seen in the woman standing atop her shattered home. It had to remind the country that the war was not a test of weapons but of will. Churchill began by reviewing a stack of recent military assessments. He studied the Navy's updated convoy reports, the RAF's analysis of bomber patterns, and the Middle East Command's warnings about Rommel's maneuvers. These documents confirmed the grim reality: the crisis was not abating. Supply routes were strained, aircraft production pushed to its limits, and Britain had little margin for error anywhere in the world. Yet for the first time in months, these facts did not intimidate him. They clarified the stakes. The speech he needed to craft had to address this reality honestly, without embellishment, but also with the iron conviction that Britain would endure it. The people deserved truth, but they also deserved hope. His early drafts were blunt, too blunt. They spoke plainly of losses, dangers, and looming threats. But Churchill sensed that such a tone, while honest, lacked the emotional core the moment required. Britain had already heard the statistics. What they needed now was something deeper than information, affirmation of who they were. And so he crossed out entire paragraphs and began again, seeking a voice that could reach every citizen from the factories of Birmingham to the farms of Yorkshire, every sailor braving the Atlantic winds, every mother listening in a darkened home while sirens wailed in the distance. He wrote not from the viewpoint of the Prime Minister, but from that of the nation's conscience. To shape this new direction, Churchill looked backward and inward. He revisited passages from his own writings on history, moments when he had described nations, not armies, as the true engines of victory. He studied letters he had received from civilians, each carrying its own story of resilience. A dockworker in Liverpool who refused to abandon his shift after a raid. A schoolteacher in Coventry who reopened her classroom amid ruins. A young soldier who wrote to say he fought not for glory but for the children he hoped someday to father. These voices merged with the elderly woman's message, forming a chorus of conviction that stirred Churchill's deepest instincts for rhetoric. He began to craft a narrative centered on identity, not on what Britain possessed but on what Britain was. It would be a reminder that bombs could destroy buildings but not character, that U-boats could sink ships but not courage, that setbacks in North Africa or Greece could challenge strategy but not the nation's resolve. The speech would not deny the danger, they all lived inside it, but it would frame the danger as a measure of Britain's strength. Churchill understood something essential now: morale was not built by minimizing hardship, but by giving hardship meaning. If the people knew why they endured, they would continue to endure. As he shaped the speech, he sought a cadence that would resonate like a drumbeat. Churchill understood that rhetoric was not about ornamentation, it was about rhythm. The nation needed a message that could be carried in the memory, spoken aloud in shelters, repeated in factories, whispered by soldiers in trenches. He experimented with phrases that echoed the nation's collective heartbeat. Phrases that invoked continuity, between past and present, between leader and people, between the ruins of the moment and the future they fought to preserve. He wanted every listener to feel not merely addressed, but summoned. But the most crucial element was one he had never included in such direct form before: human vulnerability. Churchill decided that, for the first time since taking office, he would acknowledge the emotional cost of war, not only for the people but for himself. Not as confession but as connection. He would show that he, too, felt the fear, the grief, the exhaustion, that he stood with them not only as a leader but as a fellow citizen who shared their burden. This was a risk. Some might interpret it as weakness. But Churchill believed now that vulnerability was not the opposite of strength, it was the foundation of unity. By the time he finished the final draft, the message felt unlike any he had delivered before. It was not a call to arms, nor a defiant challenge to Hitler, nor a strategic outline. It was a reaffirmation, a declaration of who the British people were and why they had already proven themselves stronger than the storm that battered them. As Churchill read the closing paragraphs aloud in the quiet of his study, he felt the words resonate through him with the force of that woman's voice amid the rubble. This was the message Britain needed. And as he prepared to deliver it to the nation, he sensed that he was not merely restoring morale, he was restoring the very heartbeat of Britain. The evening chosen for the broadcast arrived wrapped in a deep, uneasy quiet. London seemed to hold its breath beneath the blackout, as though the city itself sensed the importance of what was about to unfold. Churchill stood alone in his private room at Downing Street, the final draft of his message on the desk before him. The lamps were turned low, casting warm shafts of light that softened the lines of his face but did little to disguise the fatigue etched there. Outside, the distant rumble of anti-aircraft batteries signaled another incoming raid. Yet Churchill did not flinch. The moment demanded his full presence. This was not simply another speech, but a lifeline thrown to a nation on the edge of exhaustion that as he reviewed the pages one last time, Churchill felt an unfamiliar calm settle over him. The doubts that had shadowed him for weeks had not vanished entirely, but they no longer held dominion over his thoughts. He understood now that doubt was not a sign of weakness, it was a condition of leadership. What mattered was how one moved through doubt, not how one avoided it. And tonight he would move through it by speaking directly to the people who had steadied him when he faltered. The revelation he had drawn from the ruins, that leadership was a partnership, not a burden borne alone, strengthened him as he prepared to speak with unprecedented openness. His aides entered quietly, adjusting the microphone and testing the broadcast lines. Technicians moved with the practiced efficiency of men who understood the weight of Churchill's words in wartime. Every sentence he uttered could ripple through the nation, affecting morale, production, and the will to endure. The BBC director whispered final instructions, but Churchill barely heard them. His attention fixed on the microphone, a simple object of metal and wire, yet capable of carrying his voice into millions of homes, shelters, and barracks. He imagined families gathered around radios in dimly lit rooms, workers pausing in overnight factories, soldiers huddled in barracks preparing for another day of hardship. The nation waited. Churchill took his seat, the leather chair creaking softly beneath him. He removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief, then settled them back on his nose. He placed both hands on the desk, feeling the polished wood beneath his fingers, grounding himself in the physical world before stepping into the emotional realm of the broadcast. A faint vibration from the passing bombers overhead reminded him of the stakes. Tonight, he was not merely addressing an audience, but joining them in their fear and resilience. The thought sharpened his resolve. The woman in the rubble had spoken for them all. Now he would return the message. The BBC director gave a subtle nod. A red light blinked on. In that instant, the entire nation became silent, listening. Churchill began to speak, his voice low and steady at first, the cadence unhurried, the tone measured. He spoke of hardship without euphemism, acknowledging the weight every family carried. He spoke of the losses on land, at sea, and in the air, refusing to shield the public from the truth. But then, gradually, his voice deepened with the strength he had reclaimed. He spoke of courage, their courage, not as a poetic flourish but as the bedrock of the nation's survival. He described the spirit he had witnessed in bombed streets and shattered homes, the unbroken will that no enemy could extinguish. That he paused deliberately at key moments, allowing the silence to become part of the message. In those pauses, listeners felt the raw sincerity behind his words. Then came the most vulnerable section, one Churchill had debated including until the final minute. He spoke of his own doubts, not naming them directly, but admitting that even leaders carry the weight of fear. He told the nation that what gave him strength was not the machinery of government or the authority of office, but the courage he saw in them. It was a startling admission delivered with care, but it struck listeners with emotional force. Churchill had stepped down from the pedestal to stand among them as one of their OWN. As he reached the climax, his tone shifted into the unmistakable rhythm that had defined his greatest speeches. He spoke of endurance not as a passive state but as an act of defiance. He framed Britain's struggle as part of a larger story, a story in which ordinary men and women forged the nation's destiny through unshakable resolve. He ended with a message crafted directly from the encounter in the rubble, that no force on earth could defeat a people who refused to give up, and that as long as they stood firm, he would stand with them without hesitation, without compromise, without fear. When Churchill finished, the final words hung in the air like the last note of a hymn. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, his hands trembling slightly from the emotional expenditure. Outside, the raid intensified, but inside homes and shelters across the country, listeners remained still, absorbing what they had heard. Many would later describe the speech as a turning point, not because it promised victory but because it restored belief. Churchill had spoken not as an untouchable figure of authority, but as a man who had walked through darkness and found his way back through the light of the people he served. And in that fragile, powerful moment, the bond between leader and nation was reforged. As dawn broke the next morning, Britain awakened to a lingering sense of stillness, not the hushed dread that followed a night of bombing, but a contemplative quiet shaped by reflection. Newspapers rushed to print excerpts from Churchill's broadcast, and radios replayed segments throughout the day. In cities and villages, factories and farms, shelters and shipyards, people found themselves repeating the lines that had struck them most deeply. For once, it was not the dramatic, defiant phrases that dominated conversations, but the vulnerable passage in which Churchill admitted that the courage of ordinary citizens had sustained him. It was a revelation that humanized him without diminishing his authority. For many, it created a connection more profound than any speech he had delivered since taking office. Paragraph 2. Workers in the industrial cities were among the first to respond. In the steel foundries of Sheffield, men covered in soot paused at their machines to discuss the speech, remarking that for the first time, they felt Churchill understood the weight they carried. In shipyards along the Clyde and the Tyne, welders and riveters repeated his words as they labored over the next vessels destined for the Atlantic convoys. The idea that the Prime Minister drew strength from them, the ordinary citizens whose sweat and sacrifice fueled the war effort, ignited a quiet pride. Production numbers for the next several days reflected this uplift. Factories recorded fewer absences, fewer delays, fewer complaints. The people had heard Churchill's message and responded with renewed determination. In London, where the scars of the Blitz remained raw and visible, the reaction was even more profound. Families who had taken shelter during the raid gathered around radios in the morning to replay the broadcast, some listening in silence, others nodding with solemn agreement. Air raid wardens, exhausted from long nights guiding civilians through chaos, remarked that Churchill's words made them feel seen, not merely as functionaries of civil defense, but as central figures in Britain's resistance. Fire brigades reported a surge of volunteers. In neighborhoods still smoldering from incendiaries, citizens worked with greater energy to clear debris, repair damage, and help one another. The speech had not erased hardship, but it had reanimated the spirit with which they faced it. On the front lines overseas, the message carried a particular weight. In the desert of North Africa, soldiers read printed copies distributed by commanding officers. Many had felt forgotten in recent months, fighting in distant sands under grueling conditions while the homeland endured its own trials. Churchill's admission that he drew strength from the people, whether civilians or soldiers, brought an unexpected unity to the ranks. Men who had grown cynical felt a renewed connection to home, sensing that their struggle was recognized and valued. Officers observed subtle but unmistakable changes, straighter postures, steadier morale, and a revived sense of purpose in the preparation for battles yet to come. The naval convoys, those lifelines crossing the treacherous Atlantic, also felt the speech's impact. Sailors who faced the constant threat of U-boats gathered in cramped mess halls to listen. Many were accustomed to hearing Churchill in his most defiant moods, urging them to press on. But this message was different. When he spoke of the fear he felt on their behalf, of the courage he saw in their perilous missions, the men felt a connection that transcended rank and distance. Convoy captains later recalled that the atmosphere aboard their ships shifted perceptibly. The tone among crews became less fatalistic and more resolute. They sailed into the gray Atlantic waters with a renewed sense that Britain, from the highest office to the humblest home, stood behind them. Even Parliament, often a battleground of clashing egos and competing visions, was moved. Members who had quietly criticized Churchill's judgment now spoke with surprising respect about the broadcast. For the first time in months, the political mood softened toward unity. Churchill's vulnerability had disarmed his adversaries, not because it made him appear weak, but because it revealed the depth of his commitment. He had not sought to hide his burden. Instead, he had shared it with the nation in a way that affirmed his role rather than undermined it. The opposition benches, long simmering with doubts, now found themselves acknowledging that Churchill possessed not only strategic acumen but also emotional courage. For Churchill himself, the response was a revelation. Messages poured into Downing Street. Letters from mothers, soldiers, factory workers, sailors, teachers, dock workers, nurses, miners, each one a testament to how deeply the speech had resonated. Some expressed gratitude. Others offered encouragement. Many simply wrote to tell him that he was not alone. Churchill read as many as he could, sometimes late into the night, each letter a reminder of the nation's collective strength. The woman from the rubble had given him a spark. Now the people had given him a flame. The fog of doubt that had clouded his mind for weeks lifted further with every message he held in his hands. It was clear now that the speech had accomplished something rare in wartime leadership. It had bound the nation together in shared vulnerability and shared resolve. Churchill had spoken as a man among citizens, and the citizens had answered with a resounding affirmation that transformed the psychological landscape of the war. Britain was still battered, still endangered, still fighting for survival, but the emotional fracture that had threatened to undermine morale had been mended. Churchill sensed the shift everywhere. In the energy of factory production, in the steadiness of military briefings, in the tone of parliamentary debates, and in the courage of citizens facing another night of bombs. The message had not saved Britain outright, but it had restored the spirit that would. In the wake of the speech, Churchill found himself transformed in ways that even he had not anticipated. The doubts that had once weighed him down like iron ballast were still present, but now they served a different purpose. They sharpened his awareness, honed his judgment, and reminded him of the fragile balance upon which leadership rested. Doubt no longer paralyzed him, it clarified him. It forced him to assess risks with more precision, to consider consequences more soberly, and to approach every decision with the humility of a man who had seen the edge of despair and refused to step over it. Churchill emerged from the ordeal not weakened, but tempered, like steel hardened by flame. This change became immediately apparent within the war cabinet. Ministers accustomed to days of tense, exhausting meetings now found Churchill more measured, more patient, and paradoxically more forceful. His authority no longer rested solely on charisma or sheer willpower, but on a renewed depth of purpose. He listened more intently, asked sharper questions, and integrated dissenting views with a deliberateness that had been absent during his darker weeks. Ministers who had once tiptoed around his volatility now found themselves drawn into rigorous discussions that pushed them toward broader, more imaginative thinking. Churchill led not through fear or urgency, but through conviction grounded in clarity. This new clarity carried over into strategic planning. Churchill began re-evaluating existing assumptions, probing areas that had grown stale from routine thinking. He called for a comprehensive reassessment of convoy protections, demanding new forms of cooperation between the Royal Navy and the RAF. He pressed for greater innovation in anti-submarine warfare, new sonar tactics, improved escort vessels, and expanded use of long-range aircraft. His engagement was no longer driven by desperation but by a rejuvenated determination to outthink the enemy rather than simply outlast him. Admirals and air marshals felt invigorated by this shift, recognizing that when Churchill's mind operated at full strength, it elevated the entire war effort. The North African campaign benefited particularly from Churchill's renewed focus. Previously, he had viewed the region through a lens clouded by anxiety, fearing that every setback signaled a collapse. Now he approached it with balanced realism. He scrutinized supply chains, evaluated command structures, and encouraged bold yet calculated maneuvers to counter Rommel's mobility. Churchill insisted on reinforcing British positions without overstraining resources, blending his natural aggressiveness with a restraint born of recent introspection. The resulting strategy stabilized the situation in a way that had seemed impossible only weeks before. For the first time since Rommel's arrival, the momentum began to shift subtly but undeniably. His diplomacy also took on renewed vigor. Churchill engaged with President Roosevelt with greater confidence, crafting correspondence that combined eloquence with strategic insight. He understood that to secure American support, he needed not only to plead Britain's cause, but to demonstrate Britain's resilience. The speech had not reached American airwaves in full, but its ripple effects had, through newspapers, through diplomatic channels, through soldiers' letters home. Roosevelt sensed the change in Churchill's tone. Gone was the hint of desperation, replaced by a steadier, more resolute certainty. This shift subtly strengthened Britain's negotiating position, making it harder for American policymakers to view the island as a nation clinging to its last hope. Internally, Churchill began to reclaim aspects of his personal life that the burden of command had forced aside. He allowed himself short breaks, brief walks in St. James's Park, longer conversations with Clementine, occasional retreats to Chartwell where he could once again pick up a paintbrush. His first attempts at painting after the crisis revealed a looseness and vibrancy he had not expected. What appeared on the canvas was not an escape from leadership but an extension of it, a visual expression of the clarity he had regained. These quiet moments did more than restore his spirit. They grounded him in the emotional steadiness necessary for the battles ahead. The public perception of Churchill shifted as well. Though he had always inspired admiration, there had been an undercurrent of distance, a sense that he was a figure carved from granite, towering above the very people he led. Now, after the broadcast, that distance melted. Britain saw him not only as their leader but as a fellow sufferer in the ordeal. His willingness to reveal vulnerability had made him relatable without diminishing his stature. Crowds greeted him with a deeper warmth during his tours of bombed districts. They saw in his eyes not simply the fire of defiance, but the compassion of a man who had truly listened to them, and had been changed by them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Britain began to sense that something fundamental had shifted. The external threats remained unchanged, but the internal climate had transformed. The psychological fracture within the leadership had healed, and Churchill's renewed strength radiated outward across the nation. This rebalanced alignment, leader and people reinforcing one another, created a unity of purpose more powerful than any weapon in the British arsenal. Churchill recognized this shift with a solemn gratitude. He understood that had he not encountered that woman in the rubble, had he not faced his own doubt, Britain might have drifted toward despair. Instead, he had emerged from the darkness with a message that restored not only the nation's spirit, but his own. And with that restoration came the renewed capacity to guide Britain through the monumental challenges still ahead. The months that followed Churchill's great inner turning were anything but calm. Spring yielded to a summer of escalating pressures, military, political, and emotional. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, continued its nocturnal assaults. The Atlantic convoys remained under constant threat, their journeys measured in ships lost rather than miles gained. And Rommel, unrelenting as a desert storm, executed maneuvers that tested every inch of British resilience in North Africa. Yet what marked this period was not the absence of crisis, but the emergence of a new steadiness at the heart of British leadership. Churchill confronted each challenge with the composure of a man who had looked into the abyss and returned with a clearer sense of purpose. Britain's trials had not diminished, Churchill's spirit had grown stronger. The first major test of this renewed spirit came when intelligence reports revealed that Rommel was preparing a bold strike aimed at pushing British forces back toward Egypt. Previously, such news would have ignited in Churchill a frantic urgency, a desperate flurry of commands driven by fear that the Empire's lifeline could snap at any moment. But now he approached the threat with disciplined calm. He convened the chiefs of staff, listened to their assessments, and weighed their recommendations without interruption. His interventions were targeted rather than sweeping, probing areas of weakness, reinforcing strengths, and demanding clarity on logistics and planning. The difference in his demeanor sharpened the cabinet's confidence. Britain faced danger, but its leader no longer wavered. As Rommel's offensive began, the tension in the war room thickened. Maps were updated hourly, arrows shifting like pieces on a grand, unforgiving chessboard. Churchill monitored each report, but he did so without the frantic pacing that had previously marked his darkest days. He recognized now that his own emotional state rippled outward through the entire chain of command. Stability at the top meant stability at every level. And so he held himself steady, anchoring his responses in optimism reinforced by realism. When the battle lines wavered, he remained resolute. When scattered units reported heavy losses, he focused on reinforcing their positions rather than yielding to despair. His steadiness became a force multiplier. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Atlantic raged with renewed ferocity. German wolf packs, better coordinated than ever, launched devastating attacks that sank ships carrying vital supplies. The numbers were grim. Yet when the Admiralty delivered its bleak assessments, Churchill did not erupt, nor did he slip into fatalism. His response was pragmatic and immediate. Accelerate escort ship production, increase convoy frequency, intensify air patrols, and pushed the United States for expanded cooperation under Lend-Lease. He wielded his newly rediscovered confidence like a tool, direct, focused, and resilient. The Admiralty responded in kind, galvanized by a leader who confronted adversity without theatrics or denial. Churchill's resolve was tested not only by military threats but by political headwinds. Several MPs, emboldened by stagnation abroad, questioned whether Britain should reconsider its strategic priorities. Some argued that resources wasted in North Africa should be redirected toward home defense. Others suggested that Churchill relied too heavily on American support that remained uncertain. Under the emotional strain of months prior, such dissent might have triggered a defensive outburst. Now he addressed Parliament with calm authority. He acknowledged the hardships, explained the necessity of forward engagement, and reinforced the strategic logic with clarity sharpened by recent introspection. His confidence subdued critics not through force, but through undeniable coherence. One of the most profound tests came from the RAF, which faced mounting losses from intensifying German night raids. Aircrews were pushed to exhaustion, their numbers dwindling. Churchill visited bases to speak with pilots and ground crews, absorbing their fears and frustrations. He did not hide behind platitudes. Instead, he spoke candidly about the cost of war, expressing gratitude with a sincerity that resonated deeply. This honesty, fortified by his own experience with doubt, allowed him to connect with the airmen on a human level. They saw not only a leader demanding sacrifice, but a man who understood sacrifice, and who carried the weight of their struggle within him. Even the international situation tested his renewed resilience. Relations with the United States, though improving, remained uncertain. Isolationist sentiment still echoed through Congress, and Roosevelt had to navigate political minefields to extend support to Britain. Churchill responded with his characteristic eloquence, but now his communications felt more grounded. He appealed not to desperation but to shared destiny. His messages carried the voice of a man strengthened by the trust of his people, a man who now believed fully in the cause he represented. Roosevelt sensed this shift and responded with increasing warmth, slowly moving the United States closer to full partnership. Individually, each of these tests could have eroded morale. Collectively, they could have broken a lesser leader. But Churchill's renewed spirit created a feedback loop throughout the nation. His steadiness steadied others. His clarity sharpened strategy. His emotional resilience strengthened Britain's psychological armor. The trials of the war had not diminished. In many ways they had intensified. Yet Britain felt different. The people sensed that their leader had been reforged not by triumph, but by vulnerability transformed into strength. At a moment when external forces threatened to overwhelm the nation, Churchill's inner victory became a quiet, powerful anchor, one that held Britain firm against the storms that still gathered on the horizon. By late summer 1941, despite the renewed resolve coursing through Britain's leadership and people, the war delivered a sequence of harsh reminders that morale and determination could not alter the cold arithmetic of conflict. News from North Africa brought the first blow. Rommel, unpredictable and relentless, launched an audacious maneuver that caught British forces off guard, cutting supply lines and threatening to encircle vital positions. Churchill grimaced as he studied the maps, arrows exploding outward like fractures in glass. Though his spirit remained firm, he felt the sting of disappointment. He had hoped Britain's resurgence of morale would translate into decisive advantage, but the desert refused to bend to sentiment. War demanded endurance without expectation of reward. The Admiralty soon delivered a second blow, an exceptionally devastating week in the Atlantic. A coordinated wolf-pack assault had torn through multiple convoys, sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. The losses were catastrophic. Raw materials, food supplies, munitions, and lives disappearing beneath merciless waves. Even the most seasoned naval commanders struggled to conceal their frustration. Churchill listened to the reports in grim silence, the room heavy with the scent of cigarette smoke and seawater-soaked charts. His newly recovered confidence did not shield him from the emotional impact, but it steadied his response. Instead of panic, he demanded innovation. Instead of despair, he pressed for bold adaptation. Yet each sinking remained etched on his consciousness like a bruise. Then came the distressing news from home. A renewed series of raids on industrial cities that inflicted terrible civilian casualties. Coventry, Birmingham, and Hull were hit with heartbreaking precision. Entire streets disappeared in walls of flame. Factories critical to armaments were left in ruins. Churchill traveled to every devastated district he could, walking again through rubble and smoke. Though he carried within him the memory of the elderly woman's unbroken spirit, He could not ignore the exhaustion in the eyes of the survivors. Britain remained steadfast, yet the cost of that steadfastness deepened. He felt their pain with acute sensitivity, but instead of letting it unseat his balance, he absorbed it with solemn recognition. Leadership meant carrying the sorrow of millions. International developments offered no immediate relief. The Soviet Union, stunned by Operation Barbarossa, pleaded for a second front in the West, a request Churchill could not fulfill. Public pressure began to mount as people questioned Britain's ability to help an unexpected ally now ravaged by the Nazi onslaught. Churchill spent long hours weighing the strategic implications, aware that denying Stalin risked future alliance, yet also aware that diverting forces prematurely could doom both nations. Critics in Parliament seized the opportunity to revive old grievances. For several days, the political atmosphere crackled with tension, yet Churchill confronted the challenge with the steadiness forged during his darkest hours. He refused to be rushed by fear or manipulated by political theatrics. Still, the setbacks inflicted emotional blows that tested Churchill's inner equilibrium. Late at night, after meetings concluded and the corridors of Downing Street fell quiet, he felt the familiar tug of doubt returning, not in the overwhelming, suffocating form it once had, but as a cold whisper at the edge of consciousness. Had he underestimated Rommel? Had he acted too slowly in reinforcing the Atlantic defenses? Had he placed too much faith in Britain's production capacity? These questions emerged in the solitude of the early hours, casting long shadows across his desk. But the difference now was profound. He did not spiral. He acknowledged the doubts, then set them aside as tools for analysis rather than triggers for despair. Even his closest advisors noticed the subtle shift. When faced with discouraging news, Churchill no longer reacted with volatile intensity or curt dismissals. Instead, he asked incisive questions, probing weaknesses without personal agitation. He demanded accountability, not scapegoats. His newly tempered leadership steadied the command structure even in moments of genuine crisis. Admirals, generals, and ministers adapted to this rhythm, finding themselves less defensive, more open to creative solutions, more engaged in shared responsibility. Churchill's internal transformation had become an organizational asset. This did not mean, however, that Churchill had become immune to the emotional weight of the war. Some nights, as he paced his study with a cigar burning low, he felt a piercing sorrow for the lives lost in the Atlantic, for the soldiers fighting under alien suns, for the civilians whose homes were reduced to dust. The burden remained immense. But now he carried it not as a man bracing against collapse, but as a leader fortified by the trust of his people. The memory of that woman standing atop her ruined home, the voice that had resurrected his strength, returned to him often. She had endured loss and yet refused despair. Her defiance became his compass. As setback followed setback, Churchill recognized a paradox at the heart of leadership. True resilience was not measured by the absence of doubt, but by the ability to navigate through it without losing direction. He felt the strain, but he remained aligned with his purpose. The war was entering a phase of unprecedented complexity, and Britain's survival depended on leaders who could think beyond fear, beyond anger, beyond the immediate calamities. Churchill had learned to do so through the crucible of his own crisis. The shadows of setbacks still stretched long across Britain, but he now understood that shadows existed only where light still burned. By autumn of 1941, the burden of global war rested on Churchill with a completeness that no other British leader in memory had ever faced. He was the central nexus of every decision: military, political, diplomatic, industrial. Every telegram from abroad, every intelligence intercept, every plea from the home front passed across his desk. Yet the internal transformation that had taken place within him months earlier now shaped how he bore this immense pressure. He no longer saw command as a solitary mountain to climb, but as a landscape he traversed with the nation at his side. Even so, leadership remained an isolating experience. In the late hours, when meetings had ended and staff dispersed, he felt the quiet return with its familiar reminder. Some decisions, no matter how many advisors surrounded him, belonged to him alone. This solitude sharpened Churchill's introspection. He found himself reflecting not only on strategy, but on the nature of strength itself. He realized how many leaders throughout history had collapsed under the strain of wars far smaller than this one. He did not judge them, he understood them. The human mind was not designed to shoulder the fate of millions. That he carried the weight at all felt both improbable and inevitable. In these reflective moments, Churchill sensed that the crisis he had endured earlier in the year had been more than a psychological struggle. It had been a necessary crucible. Without that confrontation with doubt, without that humbling reawakening in the rubble of the Blitz, he might have cracked under the demands of the coming months. Instead, he found within himself a surprising reservoir of resilience. Still, the responsibilities were vast. Churchill spent hours buried in reports, aircraft production numbers, troop movements, fuel reserves, merchant ship construction, intelligence summaries from Bletchley Park. He memorized details with astonishing speed, pushing his mind to its limits. His staff could barely keep pace. Yet he maintained a demanding standard because he believed knowledge was a form of armor. Understanding the full scope of Britain's vulnerabilities allowed him to compensate strategically. It also gave him a sense of control in a war defined by unpredictability. But beneath the discipline, there was also an emotional reality. He could not allow himself to be surprised again by doubt. Mastery of the facts helped prevent the shadows from returning. Churchill often retreated to the map room, that dimly lit sanctuary where the world's chaos existed in miniature on the walls. Colored pins marked progress and failure, danger and opportunity. There he spent hours tracing the arcs of battles across continents, visualizing movements in his mind. The map room staff watched in awe as he absorbed information with relentless focus. Yet even in this realm of strategy, Churchill's humanity remained evident. When he saw a position overrun or a convoy lost, he paused, not as a tactician analyzing symbols, but as a man recognizing the human lives behind every marker. This duality, strategic clarity intertwined with emotional weight, defined his leadership more powerfully than any title. Even successes carried emotional cost. When a U-boat was sunk or an enemy position captured, Churchill celebrated the strategic gain, but he also thought of the sailors who died bringing that victory about. Triumphs felt hollow without acknowledgement of the price paid. This sensitivity, once a source of internal torment, had evolved into a strength. It kept him grounded. It reminded him that war was not an abstraction but a ledger written in lives. In meetings, he spoke with deep reverence for the men who fought, careful not to let strategy drift into cold arithmetic. His emotional awareness, once a vulnerability, had become a guiding force that prevented him from becoming detached or indifferent. His private writings from this period reveal a man wrestling with the philosophical implications of command. He pondered destiny, free will, duty, and the moral cost of decision-making. He wrote about the nature of courage, not as the absence of fear but as the mastery of it. He reflected on the paradox of leadership, that the strongest leaders were often the ones who felt fear most acutely, because they understood what was at stake. These writings were not intended for public eyes, but they demonstrate how deeply Churchill had internalized the lessons of his earlier crisis. He no longer saw doubt as an enemy to be crushed, but as a companion that sharpened judgment when kept in its proper place. Despite the grinding pressure, Churchill preserved moments of personal humanity. He joked with staff, entertained with wit, and infused the war cabinet with bursts of energy that broke tension even in the bleakest hours. These moments were not frivolous, they were survival mechanisms. His humor, his eccentric routines, his dinners that stretched past midnight kept him emotionally balanced. Clementine noticed the difference. Though she worried for his health, she sensed that he was carrying the war's burden with a steadier heart. The weight had not lightened, but he had grown stronger beneath it. As autumn deepened, Churchill understood with profound clarity the essence of his role, not to eliminate fear but to prevent it from ruling the nation. The people needed a leader who felt the weight of their suffering yet refused to be paralyzed by it. In meeting after meeting, in speech after speech, in private memo after private reflection, Churchill embodied this dual responsibility. He had emerged from his personal crucible transformed, not into a flawless leader but into a resilient one. And because he had mastered his own doubt, he was now prepared to guide Britain through the darkest, most unpredictable phase of the war yet to come. As winter settled over Britain, the impact of Churchill's transformation, and of the message that had rekindled the nation's resolve, began to ripple far beyond the island's battered shores. Diplomats stationed across Europe and the Middle East reported with cautious optimism that Britain's morale had not only stabilized but had become a source of fascination among occupied nations. Resistance movements in France, Norway, the Netherlands, and Poland circulated clandestine translations of Churchill's post-Blitz broadcast. Though heavily censored by the Germans, the fragments that escaped into underground networks carried unmistakable significance. Britain had suffered, Britain had doubted, but Britain had not broken. For those living in the suffocating darkness of occupation, the mere existence of such resilience became a quiet weapon of defiance. In Vichy France, where collaborationist officials tread a careful line between loyalty and coercion, French officers who disliked the regime listened secretly to BBC broadcasts. What struck them most was not Churchill's martial rhetoric, but the vulnerability he had displayed months earlier. They understood leadership under strain. They saw the moral collapse that had occurred in their own government when fear eclipsed judgment. Churchill's honesty about his personal doubts stood in stark contrast to the brittle posturing of the Vichy leaders. This contrast fueled quiet resentment among French officers and intellectuals who longed for a different path. For them, Churchill's voice became a reminder of the moral courage their own leaders lacked. In the Middle East, where British command struggled to balance military imperatives with volatile political realities, Churchill's renewed strength helped stabilize wavering alliances. Arab leaders, many of whom had been skeptical of Britain's capacity to withstand the German onslaught, began to reassess. They observed that despite bombings, blockades, and battlefield setbacks, Britain's internal unity had not fractured. Reports from diplomatic envoys emphasized that Churchill seemed stronger now than at any point since the war began. His unwavering presence, even conveyed through carefully worded telegrams, signaled to friendly governments that Britain was a reliable partner, not a faltering empire on the brink of collapse. In the United States, the emotional resonance of Churchill's message emerged more gradually but with lasting effect. American newspapers picked up stories about the broadcast and the public's reaction, framing the moment as a testament to British perseverance. For many Americans still wary of deeper involvement in the war, this portrayal shifted perceptions. Britain was no longer seen as a beleaguered nation clinging to survival but as a resilient democracy fighting with unbroken will. Roosevelt, who had always sensed Churchill's inner strength, now used these narratives to make the case that supporting Britain was not an act of charity but a strategic investment in a determined ally. Subtle shifts in public opinion followed, laying the emotional groundwork for decisions that would later prove decisive. Within the Soviet Union, Churchill's steadiness was interpreted through the lens of existential desperation. Stalin, locked in the brutal struggle against the German invasion, received British assurances with the guarded skepticism that defined his worldview. Yet even Soviet propagandists could not entirely obscure the significance of Britain's endurance. As German armies pressed toward Moscow, Soviet citizens clung to any sign that the Nazis could be resisted. Reports that Britain continued to fight, despite bombings, despite shortages, despite isolation from the continent, bolstered Soviet morale. Though Churchill's personal message did not reach them directly, its consequences did. Britain did not break, and therefore resistance, however costly, remained possible. Meanwhile, across the vast expanse of the British Empire, Churchill's leadership exerted renewed pull. In India, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, newspapers tracked his movements and speeches with an intensity that suggested more than mere political interest. Soldiers from these nations fought in distant theaters, often with no immediate connection to Britain's island reality. Yet Churchill's steadfastness offered a unifying thread. In letters home from Commonwealth troops, many described feeling a personal connection to the man whose voice carried across oceans. The pathos of his earlier doubt made him feel human. His resurgence made him feel formidable. This combination strengthened imperial cohesion at a moment when unity could not be taken for granted. Neutral nations observed these developments with keen interest. In Sweden and Switzerland, intelligence analysts noted that British diplomacy had grown more assured, more confident. Trade discussions, negotiations over refugees, and covert operations reflected a nation operating not under panic, but under purposeful stability. Even countries wary of provoking German retaliation noticed the shift. British envoys reported that while neutrality remained official policy, the tone of conversations had subtly changed. There was growing recognition that Britain, far from collapsing, was poised to endure. Churchill's inner victory had quietly reshaped international perceptions of the war's trajectory. What emerged from these global reverberations was a profound realization. The message that had saved Britain was no longer Britain's alone. Its emotional impact, forged in the ruins of the Blitz and broadcast across the airwaves, had become a source of inspiration for millions who yearned for proof that tyranny could be resisted. Churchill had spoken as a man humbled by suffering and restored by the courage of his people. Now that transformation, once a deeply personal struggle, had become an international symbol. The world saw in Britain's survival not merely military endurance, but the triumph of a collective spirit steeled by honesty, resilience, and shared resolve. And as the war expanded toward an even more uncertain future, that message grew in importance, echoing far beyond the island that had given it birth. By the final weeks of 1941, an eerie quiet settled over Britain, not the quiet of peace, but the taut stillness that precedes a shift in the tide of war. Churchill felt it in the war rooms, in the rhythms of cabinet meetings, in the tone of intelligence briefings. The setbacks that had battered the summer and autumn still loomed large, yet beneath them ran an unmistakable current of change. Britain had not broken during its hardest year. Instead, it had found a renewed center of gravity. The nation's psychological resilience was now stronger than its material vulnerabilities. Churchill did not yet know what form the coming shift would take, but he sensed that history's hinge was beginning to turn, slowly but unmistakably. The first hint of this shift emerged from North Africa. British forces, bolstered by a reorganization of command and fresh material, launched Operation Crusader against Rommel's Panzer Army. Initial reports were mixed, moments of success punctuated by confusion and retreat. But Churchill recognized something different in the tone of the dispatches: determination rather than desperation. British units were fighting not as men clinging to survival, but as soldiers reclaiming momentum. The battles were brutal, strewn with loss and uncertainty, yet gradually the balance began to tip. Rommel, for all his brilliance, could not stretch his logistics indefinitely. As the Germans faltered, British forces pressed forward. For the first time in months, Churchill allowed himself a cautious spark of strategic optimism. Back home, the home front underwent its own quiet transformation. Industrial output, once erratic due to bombings and exhaustion, began to stabilize. The Ministry of Aircraft Production reported steady increases, aided by innovations and improved quality control. Shipyards accelerated the construction of escort vessels desperately needed for the Atlantic convoys. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, filling skilled positions with remarkable proficiency. Churchill observed these changes with pride tempered by realism. He knew production alone could not win the war, but he also understood that industrial resilience was the heartbeat of national survival. Britain was learning to fight not only with courage, but with efficiency and adaptation. The Battle of the Atlantic, though still perilous, showed early signs of improvement. New radar technologies, refined sonar tactics, and strengthened convoy escorts began to counter the deadly precision of German wolfpacks. The Admiralty reported a slight reduction in losses, a small yet significant indicator that the tide might be turning. Churchill treated this cautiously. He had watched hope collapse before. Yet his renewed perspective allowed him to appreciate incremental progress without slipping into false optimism. Every ship that arrived safely mattered. Every convoy that broke through strengthened the nation's resolve. These modest gains were the first cracks in the U-boat campaign that had once seemed unassailable. Diplomatically, Churchill sensed that Britain's endurance was reshaping the geopolitical landscape. Nations that had once dismissed British resilience as temporary now began viewing the country as a durable pillar in the anti-Nazi struggle. Roosevelt, increasingly convinced of Britain's staying power, pushed for deeper collaboration. Intelligence cooperation intensified. Shared planning expanded. Even before America made its fateful decision, the partnership between the two nations grew thicker, more substantial. Churchill interpreted these developments not as signs of imminent salvation, but as a validation of the emotional transformation that had begun with his crisis months earlier. A nation capable of overcoming internal doubt could withstand external threat. Amid these developments came the event that would redefine the war's course: Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and America's subsequent entry into the conflict. Churchill received the news with a mixture of shock, sorrow, and profound strategic clarity. He understood instantly that the war had changed. Britain was no longer fighting with uncertain help from across the Atlantic. It now had a full partner, a colossal industrial power whose eventual mobilization would dwarf anything the Axis could muster. Yet Churchill's reaction was shaped not by triumph but by the humility gained through personal ordeal. He recognized the coming struggle would be long and devastating, demanding sacrifices on a scale none had yet imagined. With America's entry into the war, Churchill faced new responsibilities. He prepared to journey across the Atlantic to coordinate strategy with Roosevelt, aware that Britain's voice in the partnership must be firm yet cooperative. The old Churchill, before the woman in the ruins, before the night of doubt, might have approached the alliance with impulsive zeal, seeking to dominate discussions through force of personality. But the transformed Churchill understood the necessity of balance. Confidence tempered by vulnerability, strength fortified by humility, these qualities would guide him in the new phase of global leadership. He was not a man seeking applause. He was a man seeking victory grounded in unity. As 1941 drew to its close, Churchill reflected on the journey that had brought him to this turning point. The doubts that had once gripped him felt distant, not erased but integrated into a deeper understanding of himself and of leadership. The message that had saved Britain, born in the rubble, voiced in honesty, echoed by millions, had not only restored the nation's spirit but had prepared it for the immense challenges ahead. With the world now fully at war, Britain stood not as a beleaguered island awaiting rescue, but as a resilient nation entering a global alliance with its head unbowed. Churchill sensed that the most decisive struggles still lay ahead, yet unlike before he did not fear them. The fire within him burned steady and sure, a light strong enough to guide a nation through whatever darkness remained. As Churchill crossed the Atlantic aboard HMS Duke of York in December 1941, the weight of the world rested upon him, but it no longer threatened to crush him. The icy winds that tore across the deck seemed less biting than the storms he had weathered within his own mind months earlier. He paced the ship's corridors not with the frantic urgency of a desperate leader but with the steady deliberation of a man prepared for history's next chapter. The message that had saved Britain, his message, born of crisis yet strengthened by the people, had become the unspoken compass guiding his every thought. He knew that the alliance he was about to forge would shape the future of the war, but he also knew that alliances meant nothing without the internal strength of the nations that formed them. Britain had found that strength and he had found his. During long stretches at sea, Churchill revisited the darkest moments of the year. He recalled standing in the ruins of London, his spirit cracking under the weight of responsibility. He remembered the sleepless nights in Downing Street, when every setback felt like a personal failure and every strategic decision carried the threat of catastrophe. Yet these memories no longer twisted with shame or fear. Instead, they formed a map, an emotional cartography of leadership forged through pain and regained through courage. He realized that those moments had not weakened him, they had revealed the depths of the burden he carried and the resilience required to bear it. The woman in the rubble had reflected that resilience back at him, reminding him of the unbreakable spirit that lay beneath Britain's suffering. Upon arriving in Washington, Churchill carried himself with a renewed clarity that impressed even those who had long admired him. Roosevelt noticed it immediately, the steadiness in Churchill's eyes, the controlled intensity in his voice, the humility woven through his confidence. This was not the man who had struggled under the shadow of doubt earlier in the year. This was a leader tempered by crisis and restored by collective courage. Churchill made his case for coordinated strategy not as a supplicant pleading for assistance but as an equal partner prepared to share the burdens of global war. The sincerity born of his personal journey gave his words gravity. American generals and statesmen sensed that they were not merely hearing a plan, but witnessing the resolve of a nation that refused to fall. In speeches and radio broadcasts delivered from Washington, Churchill addressed the British people with a tone that blended reassurance and realism. He made no promises of quick victory. Instead, he emphasized endurance, the same endurance that had sustained Britain through the Blitz, through rationing, through heartbreaking losses at sea. He spoke of sacrifice but also of purpose. His words carried the cadence of a man who knew pain intimately, who had confronted fear and emerged stronger. The British people heard in his voice their own struggle reflected back with dignity. For them, Churchill's transformation was not an abstract notion. It was a lived experience that resonated with the hardships they continued to endure. As 1942 dawned, Britain's position remained perilous in many respects. The war expanded into new theaters, the demands on resources intensified, and enemy advances threatened vital regions of the globe. Yet the British spirit, shaken earlier in the year, nearly broken in Churchill himself, had hardened into something enduring. The leadership crisis that might have fractured the nation had instead strengthened it. Civilians facing nightly blackouts carried on with quiet determination. Soldiers fighting in the desert and at sea drew strength from the knowledge that their leader understood the weight of fear and the meaning of courage. Industrial workers toiled with a sense of shared purpose, aware that their labor, like Churchill's leadership, was part of a greater whole. Churchill understood that the coming years would demand sacrifices on a scale Britain had not yet imagined. Victory was no longer a distant dream, but neither was it imminent. Yet he faced this reality with a steadiness that would have been impossible before his transformation. Doubt still whispered at times, but now it served as a reminder of humility, not a harbinger of collapse. He recognized that leadership did not mean erasing fear, it meant guiding a nation through fear toward hope. And hope, he realized, was not a fragile emotion but a discipline, one that Britain had practiced faithfully through every trial of the war. Looking back across the arc of the year, Churchill saw clearly the turning point, not in a battlefield victory, not in a diplomatic triumph, but in the night when a single voice in the ruins of the Blitz reminded him why he fought. That voice had rekindled not just his courage but the courage he would pass on to millions. The message he delivered afterward, born of honesty, humility, and shared suffering, had saved Britain in a way no weapon could. It restored faith where fear had taken root. It unified a nation when division threatened. It gave meaning to sacrifice and transformed despair into resolve. Churchill carried that truth with him now as surely as he carried any strategic plan or military directive. In the end, the endurance of Britain during its darkest year was not the result of unbroken strength, but of strength broken and remade. Churchill's battle with doubt had mirrored the nation's own struggle. Both had staggered under the weight of destruction. Both had found resilience through shared courage. And as Britain faced the long, grueling path to ultimate victory, Churchill understood that the true miracle of 1941 was not survival, but transformation. The nation had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to fight despite it. The message that had saved Britain would continue to echo through the remainder of the war, not as a moment of inspiration, but as a testament to the indomitable spirit forged when a leader and his people learned to carry their burdens together.